Hello and welcome to the Geo Optimistic. Today I would just like to cover the beginning of this almost 10-year conflict, and that is one of the other misconceptions. This war isn't just a year and a half old. This war has been going on since early 2014, and one of the biggest failures in the governments of the West and the media is how it was covered. As I know countless people who mention how this was a separatist conflict with people who wanted independence and or they wanted to join Russia. The actual progress and procedure of how the conflict started is the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych was basically too afraid to face the fire with all of the issues going on in the country during the Euromaidan revolution, and ended up fleeing the country to Russia out of nowhere. Nobody knew where he was. Nobody had any idea of the circumstances in which he disappeared. And so Ukraine was left basically leaderless for quite a while. And so once he fled, the separatist areas, quote, separatist, they were flooded with GRU agents and particularly Igor Girkin to foment chaos. And they certainly did achieve that, but it wasn't a naturally occurring organic protest. The majority of the people protesting were the Russian-sent operatives to flood Ukraine with, one, money to influence people, and two, these are trained operatives that have been involved in many of Russia's imperialist conquests, whether that's in Transnistria, which was one of their very first, quote, separatist situations, where they take advantage of a smaller, weaker country in order to further their own personal gains. And so this group of terrorists and GRU operatives, and I'll get to why I called them terrorists in just a sec, they were killing the democratically voted in politicians, like mayors and many of the opposition leaders of the area. But what Russia decided to focus on were the territories of Ukraine that voted for Viktor Yanukovych, which Yanukovych, you fled to Russia. That is a pretty damning indictment of your character. If you were democratically elected and truly had the mandate of the people, you would have stayed. But after the chaos that ensued during the Euromaidan protests, due to the lethal force used on just regular protesters that were permitted by Yanukovych and also had the support of the former campaign manager of Yanukovych, Paul Manafort, who later became a campaign manager for one of our presidents. And there is a lot of convoluted ties that US politicians have in Ukraine, but it was almost a proxy to become shady with Russia with more coverage. And Yanukovych, his campaign staff, including Manafort, they had this idea of using lethal force on the protesters who were peaceful at the time. Not only shooting on them, but shooting on medical personnel, shooting on anything that they could see. So after Yanukovych fled to Russia, Russia poured into all of the regions that voted for Yanukovych with all of the assets and support that their GRU agents would need to conduct a effective and successful campaign of capitalizing on a bad situation for the people of Ukraine. And what that ended up leading to was success in Donetsk and Luhansk, as that was the closest to Russia. And from the beginning, these fighters were Russian soldiers. The Russian soldiers themselves were the first to admit it because they were dying there. They were dying there. Their family weren't being notified that they had been killed. People couldn't collect the funds that they get for having a fallen family member. And so that leads us to the Minsk agreements. Now there's two Minsk agreements, and so we'll start off with Minsk 1. So the first agreement was a immediate ceasefire along the current lines of control as they were, and while that signing was going on between Russia and Ukraine, who at the time Russia was denying any involvement whatsoever, that they had no troops there, they had no influence on the situation. So why were they party to the negotiations if they had nothing to do with it? The representatives were from Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. So if Russia had nothing to do with it, then they'd have no need to negotiate on the behalf of these separatists, in quotes, because that is one of the biggest damning miscalculations on the West that I'm glad has shifted towards supporting Ukraine. But at the time, what Russia would do is massage the timing. They would conduct an assault or some sort of aggressive move to destabilize the situation, but report it happening way earlier than it did and using a following Ukrainian either law or action and claim it was a retaliatory measure on the Ukrainians' part. So what they would do is they would launch missiles, anti-air missiles or anti-tank missiles, from heavily populated civilian areas and then leave. But they would wait for Ukraine to attack, publish it in the media, and influence the West that Ukraine was the one escalating and attacking civilians, even though they were the ones who engaged. So with the first Minsk agreement, Russia, at the exact moment of signing, was bombarding several Ukrainian cities, and the implementation of the agreement had almost no purpose from the jump. I don't know how there ended up being two, but at the time, Ukraine was in a weak position. Imagine somebody kicks down your door and steals your baby with a gun to its head. That's going to be pretty hard to have any influence over the situation. Now, what happened is the ceasefire was never successfully implemented on Russia's side. They did not follow through with the agreement whatsoever. And so Ukraine, being the one on defense, protecting itself and its sovereign territory, they got blamed and pitted for it. They got pitted for all of the problems in the situation. And the same thing happened with the second ceasefire, but this one was almost worse. They were still fighting after the agreement took the city of Debaltseve, and the agreements culminated in nothing. And with the second Minsk agreement, at the time of signing the agreement, Russia was launching major offensive at the Donetsk airport. And they ended up seizing the airport after they leveled it to the ground with everybody inside after promising them safe passage out. And the horrendous coverage that even some reporters in the West do today on the situation is they just took Russia at their word. It still baffles me to this day. And we have some political commentators who, because of the West's divisive culture wars and tribal associations at this point, they decided, okay, our media, the mainstream's being too pro-Ukrainian, so the opposite move in this situation would be anti-Ukrainian and pro-Russian. And the saddest thing about that is you can still see it today with the same actors. They fomented the disruption of U.S. discourse on the situation by getting it involved with our ludicrous culture wars. And you can even see that today where it says, Russia has taken Bakhmut, the end and turning point of the war, and then with Ukrainian territorial claims and advances, say allegedly Ukraine has moved forward. And the way that we represent this conflict is by square miles instead of the tactically advantageous and hardest fought for territories. So when you look at it on all objective levels, Ukraine has been decimating Russia. And I mean that in the sense that all reasonable expectation, they have gone above and beyond. The fact that they didn't collapse in the first month like everybody was speculating, that was a true show of force of the Ukrainian people and the armed forces of Ukraine, their ingenuity and their skill. And ever since then, they've been clawing back territory, whether that's one oblast at a time or one tree line at a time. But they have been advancing in the most critical areas in the south and in the east, and they've been trading space for time. These are all fairly intricate military tactics and wordage, so I'm going to avoid some of that. But the whole issue began with our media and a lot of government officials, and when I say our, I mean the United States. They would misrepresent the facts, just taking Russia at face value, when Russia was flooding with armored personnel carriers, they were flooding with main battle tanks, and all the resources that the Russian soldiers on the ground could need. And this is still pre-2022 conflict. And I have had a lot of people mention, well, didn't Ukraine violate the Minsk agreements? Well, there were two, and Ukraine violated none of them, considering that Russia had already been abusing the ceasefire to strike Ukraine while they weren't looking, while they were expecting peace or some sort of relative ceasefire or peace to be conducted by both sides, which they never were, acting in good faith, which is something that you cannot say about the Russians. Throughout the entirety of this conflict, they throw basically a hissy fit. They act like a little child when Ukraine uses cluster munitions or receives cluster munitions, even though Russia had been using them since the beginning of the conflict, from day one. They basically, if you hear it from the Kremlin, unfortunately, because I have respect for the history of Russia being our ally in World War II. I did not want to be anti-Russia, but they have created this situation. And unfortunately, we have massacres like Bucha to show the character of the modern Russian government, the modern Russian entity that we all turned a blind eye to. And another misconception that is flooding the US and everyone that I talk to a different degree is that this was a provoked conflict between NATO and Russia, and that if NATO did not violate its agreements with Russia and the USSR, this never would have happened. Now that couldn't have been further from the truth. The agreement, in quotes, that supposedly happened would have been with the predecessor nation of the Soviet Union, and Russia and the Russian Federation is not the Soviet Union. They did follow through on some treaties that the USSR was obliged to do as the successor state, but this supposed arrangement was between the leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, and a supposed representative of the United States. I think he might have been the Undersecretary of Defense or something like that. But the conversation was just that, it was with words. And nobody was there, it wasn't recorded at the time, but one thing is known is that President Bush immediately reprimanded this person for any of the negotiations, in quotes, that they were trying to achieve at the time. And one thing that the Soviet Union wanted much more than any sort of agreements about any of the other nations in Eastern Europe and Central Europe was money, which the US was flooding into the Soviet Union as we did not want them to collapse. We did everything we could to sustain the Soviet Union, to aid them throughout the struggles of the late 80s and the early 90s, and we were operating in good faith to the fullest extent. And you can look at the efforts that we've tried to put through to keep that nation together. Now, once the Russians and the Soviet Union decided to just lose its mind in the last few months of its existence with the failed coup, with Boris Yeltsin undermining Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union collapsed due to its own internal mismanagement. to the fullest extent. And after that, we had President Bill Clinton and President Boris Yeltsin, who were very, very good friends. They got along incredibly well. And after Poland, and I support Poland and NATO fully, but Poland wasn't just going to ask to be a member of NATO. They were actively almost blackmailing the West to get into NATO. But they said if we didn't get immediate Article 5 protection and security guarantees, we have no choice but to pursue nuclear weapons for our own security. And who knows to what degree they were intending on doing that. But we know for sure that they needed to get into NATO from their survival's perspective. And them, along with a few other nations, were able to strong arm their way into the situation, which I cannot blame them, having Russia as your neighbor. But NATO's supposed encroachment on Russia is directly due to the fact that Russia is an aggressive neighbor and a bad faith actor who believes that might is right. Even to this day, they believe these things. And so none of these members, we don't ask anyone to join NATO. They have to ask to join us and follow a very extensive process. Now, if Russia felt truly threatened by NATO, they wouldn't have diverted all of the border troops from the neighboring NATO territories that they shared a border with. That is the most defining truth on the situation. If they actually felt a threat and felt like they were at war with the United States and NATO, which they like to say, they would be keeping every ounce of strength they could on all of the borders that they have. Now, something that I think people also misunderstand and don't understand about Ukraine is they had the third largest nuclear stockpile in the world, and they only signed it over after getting security guarantees from the United States and Russia to guarantee their territorial integrity, and then they would give up their nukes. And you hear a lot of things that people say, oh, the launch codes were in Moscow, they couldn't have used them anyway, etc., etc. But the coup in Russia that we had just seen with Wagner earlier this year, that proved this as a fantasy. If they were able to just take off the top of one of these nuclear warheads and then put it in some sort of artillery shell or ballistic missile they have on the field or in their S-400, S-300 air defense systems, they could successfully nuke anybody that they wanted within the range of those equipment. Or they could at least make a dirty bomb, and I should say and or, because they could do both. So Ukraine was already violated by Russia prior to any of these Minsk agreements. And they had been acting in this manner before Ukraine had intended on joining NATO. As right after the collapse of the Soviet Union and even slightly before, Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin were aiming for Crimea, willing to do anything that they could to annex and occupy Crimea, which Mikhail Gorbachev, being the best Russian leader they've ever had and being a relatively good guy in comparison to his predecessors, decided against it. Same with Boris Yeltsin, but that didn't stop several island conflicts between Kerch and Crimea, where Russia engaged trying to take Ukraine's territory, which were just small islands between the two. They ended up losing that conflict, but that was in the 90s. And even in the year 2007, Russia offered to split Ukraine with Poland, and arguing that Ukraine isn't even a country to our former president George Bush, the second Bush. And so these have been things stoking between Ukraine and Russia, not only for decades, but centuries. If you look all the way from the 1200s and the Kievan Rus and how that relationship degraded over time, and how Russia's main goal with its affiliation with Ukraine is to Russify them, to take their territory and take their people and use it to their own advantage. And they went from banning the Ukrainian language under Catherine the Great to just trying to starve them all to death and into submission like Stalin did in the Holodomor. And that is something that we desperately need to work on as a country, is our trust in truth and our ability to perceive it ourselves, as the truth is out there It is easily, well, not easily out there. Anything good is worth putting in effort and working for. And that is how one person is able to see the conflict and attain the information properly. And, the first casualty of war is the truth, which in a lot of circumstances it is. But in this situation, it is just reprehensible how things have gone down. How the phrasing of the military and civilian aid that we have given to Ukraine is that as if it's a handout, as if the money that we're sending them isn't immediately going to the pockets of U.S. defense contractors to refill our own stock. None of the money, for the most part, is actually getting into Ukraine. We are paying ourselves to manufacture this equipment. That means American jobs, that means better for the economy, and it's better for business. And none of these things are handouts. These are loans. These are loans that Ukraine intends on paying back. These are loans that have nothing to do with just a gift. They're not gifts. They're not handouts. We're not being taken advantage of. Ukraine is doing us a favor. Ukraine is helping all of the West right now, putting up the most courageous resistance I think any European army, maybe besides Poland, would ever consider putting up to the Russians. And the expansion creep, or the scope creep, of Ukraine's ability has gone a long way into negatively influencing the West's perspective. As when the Russians failed in their Kyiv offensive, that was a miracle. Everybody thought that was a military miracle, and that no one would have ever expected Ukraine to be able to do that. Yet they were. They had successfully repelled attacks on the territory near Kyiv. They did not fall. Their capital withheld and their government held. Now, it's shifted to, if Ukraine doesn't make a major breakthrough and take back all of its territory in the first weeks of an offensive, all of a sudden, they're collapsing, their military is failing, their counteroffensive is failing. And I think that this is doing a disservice not only to ourselves, but this is doing a disservice to freedom. This is doing a major disservice to democracy, because we were not able to vote unanimously on something that is our principle. Our principle is for freedom and liberty for all. Send us your sick, send us your weary, send us your poor. We've always been oriented towards standing up for the people who believe in the same things that we do. And right now, this is one smaller nation being abused by a larger nation, and using the fact that they have nuclear weapons as a deterrent against us, using the world with nuclear threats to get the geopolitical outcome that they desire. And that is just unfortunate that we have been so divided as a country that we cannot even see the unanimous consensus that is needed. We would have been able to agree on all of this stuff if this was 20 years ago. And the horrific thing is, it's just maybe 4 or 5 people that strictly for political gain are abusing the system, abusing our democracy, doing things that have never happened in the United States history. As they say, it is all over Ukraine funding, which is despicable, because we are creating jobs for America. We are arming our allies. We are basically paying ourselves. The money stays in the United States. And if we're just going off of the important metrics, Ukraine's attrition ratio has been almost 1-4, and in some cases it's 1-7, like in Bakhmut. And I won't deny Russia's successes. They have had a few on the battlefield, not nearly as strategic as they were able to achieve in the first few months of the conflict. But they took Bakhmut. Took them 10 months to take one small city. They had the 56th anniversary of the 3-day special military operation. Their goals have gone from protecting the people of the Donbass and saving them from a genocide, to we need to block the NATO expansion, we need to do this, we need to do that. But something that people don't understand is everybody in Ukraine speaks Russian. Everybody in Ukraine speaks Russian. Every single one of them, and about 70% speak Ukrainian. Russia is the lingua franca of the area, and so using the defenders of the Russian language as an excuse would be like the UK invading all of the Anglophone nations, which we'd all know is bullshit. We would all 100% know that that is ludicrous. That is insanity. And one of the biggest reasons that the West has this delusion that there was Ukrainian separatists is everybody just presumed that Russia would steamroll Ukraine, which they did not. And so once Ukrainian soldiers, and this is in 2014 era, once the Ukrainian soldiers retook several territories, the people there realized that their government cares about them. They're not going to do anything to them. They're going to keep them safe and protect them and their sovereignty. And so all of the turncoats were ending up changing back to the Ukrainians, calling them a fascist once they, the Russians fascists, once they were able to regain access to information. Now, Russia is a information dictatorship. They control what you put in, what you put out, what you see, what you don't, what you know, and what you don't. And the first thing they did when they invaded in 2014 was take over radio towers and the television stations. That way, they were able to manipulate and lie to those Ukrainians trapped under occupation, saying that this is what your government's doing, this is what we're saving you from. But they all soon learned that that was just a ruse. That was a ruse perpetuated by Russia to buy time, but once the Ukrainians started putting together an effective resistance, the civilians that they liberated were able to see, and then they started rebelling against the Russians. They were standing up for what they believe. And all of these things pinpoint to a cold, calculated, and planned invasion. The 2022 invasion was something that Russia has been planning since at least the early 2000s. And the terrorist attacks, the lies, and the manipulation that has been effective against all of us, we're better than. Our media is better than. Journalism is better than. Journalistic integrity should do more for this, but people aren't putting in the effort and the work to solidify what we have gained through our own fights for independence. And the fact that people are calling this a proxy war between the United States and Russia, well, people thought that the Revolutionary War was a proxy war between the British Empire and France. But now we look back on that with utmost certainty that that was the United States' fight for freedom and liberation, which is how this conflict will be seen in retrospect, as that is the only truth to the situation. We are supporting those who want to be in our camp. They believe in what we believe, and they want to be free, and we see that might isn't right. And what's going on in Ukraine is a tragedy. It is an absolute horror show. And in conflicts, there isn't always good and evil. War can be very gray, but in this situation it is blatantly clear who is good and who is just the most demonic entity, and I use that in just a metaphor, but the most wicked entity that we have seen in almost a century in how they're conducting this war. And what I think is one of the biggest misrepresentations of the situation is that this is somehow two-sided. When Russia waited for there to be disarray domestically inside the borders of Ukraine to attack, they wanted to attack for years, and the second that there was enough political tension for them to steal Crimea and to steal other territories was when they saw the Ukrainians going through internal conflict over it. And the Western drift did not start in 2014, as people call it a coup. Calling it a coup is ludicrous when they enshrined it in their constitution that they wanted to join NATO in the 90s, and they also had the addition of joining the European Union. So what I would suggest for a lot of people is, including when you're listening to me, is find your sources, read up on the conflict, find your own sources, and triangulate this with what I'm saying, and maybe even a pro-Russian commentator. I've not seen a single one that hasn't just sounded ludicrously insane, but finding truth is important, and don't believe everything that you hear, don't believe everything you read, and aggregate a bunch of information on your own and triangulate what you believe from that. And the last thing that I will add to this is, when you're seeing somebody comment on the situation and they are just making slander after slander, just pause and listen to what they're saying. Is there any reason somebody speaking with objectivity would be discussing the things the way that they are? I believe in Ukraine and their ability to liberate all of their territory, but if they said that they had a grand goal of taking St. Petersburg and them liberating Verbove or Lysychansk or Kharkiv is a clear indication that they'll get all the way to Vladivostok by the end of the year. That is a ludicrous jump in expectations or even possibility. And you can see videos of people saying, yeah, Ukraine is failing, they might have taken this territory, but they won't take that, their government's collapsing, their military's collapsing. And then they'll go to Russia, who's had nothing but immediate failure at the time, and say, look, this liberation of 1 square mile means that Odessa is still in their sights, and that Kyiv is still in their sights, and they'll be back there in a month. If Russia intended on playing this lightly, like if Russia had any ability to go further, they would have. They gave everything they got into the thrust for Kyiv. They would not have left if they did not get kicked out of there. That is with every single territory. And the difference between Ukraine and Russia is Ukraine is they have to fight with everything tied behind their back besides their pinky. And Russia is giving it everything that they have right now. They're pulling out tanks from Stalin's era and throwing them in the front line with soldiers who have nothing more than a grenade. The Russian minorities, for the most part, as well. And, you know, if we stop supporting Ukraine, then all of the restrictions that we have placed upon them, like not using our weapons on Russia's territory, which is stupid, that it's dumb. But if we do not keep supporting them, then they get all of their fighting capability to direct at whatever they want. So if somebody wants to, quote, de-escalate the conflict, we need to support Ukraine to victory, because if they feel like they're going to lose our support, I guarantee that every single strategic location inside of Russia, including the Kremlin and Putin's palace, will be a valid target, as they already are today. So if Russia could have, they would have. They're giving it everything that they've got. Currently, Ukraine has several restrictions that have been imposed by the West to make sure that they, quote, don't escalate, even though the escalation was the war. The war crime was the invasion. There's no further escalation left when you have boots on the ground, when you've killed tens of thousands of civilians. There is no escalation above that. And if people think nuclear war is the next, I want to tell you, no dictator wants to die, and that is their first priority. That is why you see Russia, when they're honoring the fallen soldiers and the anniversaries of these specific events, from 2021, where the honor guards had rifles, to 2022, they made sure that there was nobody around, and the honor guards sitting there were completely disarmed, even with fake ceremonial rifles. Whereas you will see the president of Ukraine going to the front line to meet soldiers, all having AKs and ARs, and they're all armed to the teeth. And so if you had a president with an actual mandate of public support, they wouldn't be worrying about an honor guard killing them. Now, I hope that you guys have a good day. I appreciate you listening. I will keep putting more and more information out there, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you.